As the sun rose over the vast Pacific Ocean, the roar of American fighter planes filled the sky. Pilots braced themselves for a daring mission, one that could turn the tide of war. Their target: heavily guarded Japanese carriers. Armed with torpedoes and sheer determination, these brave airmen faced relentless enemy fire in a high-stakes battle where survival was anything but guaranteed. The American pilots tightened their grips on the controls as they soared over the endless blue expanse of the Pacific. Their mission was clear: strike the heart of the Japanese fleet. Intelligence had reported the presence of enemy carriers, the backbone of Japan's naval power. If they could land a decisive blow, it would cripple enemy operations and give the U.S. Navy a much-needed advantage. But the pilots knew this wouldn't be easy. The Japanese fleet was well armed, its carriers protected by destroyers, cruisers, and an elite force of fighter planes ready to intercept any approaching threat. As they neared the target zone, the pilots remained silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. The weight of the mission bore down on them, but fear had no place here. Every one of them had trained for this moment, enduring endless drills and mock attacks. They had learned to maneuver through enemy fire, to launch torpedoes under extreme pressure, and to evade the lethal bite of enemy Zero fighters. Now, it was time to put that training to the test. Ahead, dark shapes emerged on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. Japanese carriers, their decks bustling with activity, prepared for battle. Fighter planes sat ready, their pilots waiting for the inevitable clash. The Americans adjusted their formations, the lead pilot signaling to the rest of the squadron. There was no turning back. Then the sky erupted. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life, filling the air with a deadly storm of flak. Black clouds burst around the American planes, each explosion sending shards of metal through the sky. The pilots tightened their grips, weaving through the chaos as best they could. Some dove low, skimming the waves to avoid detection, while others stayed high, drawing fire to give their comrades a chance to reach the carriers. Tracer rounds streaked past, illuminating the sky in a chaotic dance of light and fire. The Japanese defenders were relentless, their gunners locked onto the incoming planes. The pilots felt the shudder of bullets striking fuselages, the sharp jolt as shrapnel tore through wings. One plane spiraled out of control, smoke billowing from its engine before it crashed into the sea. Another was hit mid-air, bursting into flames before vanishing into the clouds. Despite the carnage, the survivors pressed on. They had one job: to release their torpedoes and cripple the carriers. The lead pilot lined up his approach, keeping his sights locked on the enemy ship ahead. His hands were steady, his breath even. At the perfect moment, he let the torpedo drop. It plunged into the ocean, cutting through the water at lethal speed. All around him, his fellow pilots did the same. Torpedoes splashed down, speeding toward their targets as the Japanese frantically tried to stop them. Destroyers maneuvered to block the attacks, dropping depth charges in a desperate attempt to detonate the weapons before they could reach their mark. Some torpedoes were destroyed, others veered off course, but a few made it through. A massive explosion rocked the nearest carrier as a torpedo struck its hull. The blast sent water and debris shooting into the air. Smoke poured from the wound, the ship listing slightly as alarms blared across its decks. But the Japanese were not finished yet. Fighters screamed through the sky, engaging the American planes in a brutal aerial battle. Machine guns rattled as both sides twisted and turned, locked in a deadly dance. The American pilots fought with everything they had, but fuel was running low, and their numbers were thinning. The order was given: pull back. Those who could broke away from the battle, their planes battered but still flying. Some wouldn't make it back. Their aircraft, too damaged to continue, went down over the ocean. Others crash-landed in the waves, hoping to be rescued before the enemy found them. As the surviving planes made their way back to the safety of their fleet, the pilots looked back at the battlefield. The mission had come at a cost. Many of their comrades were gone, lost to the sea and sky. But they had struck a blow against the enemy. Though the Japanese fleet remained formidable, the damage they had inflicted would not be easily repaired. The American fighters had done their part. They had faced overwhelming odds, pushed through relentless fire, and delivered their payloads despite the danger. Their courage and determination had proven that they would not back down, no matter the cost. As they flew toward the setting sun, battered but unbroken, they knew this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, but with each battle, they edged closer to victory. The American pilots had barely begun their retreat when the Japanese counterattack intensified. The sky, already thick with smoke and fire, became even more chaotic as enemy fighters swarmed in, determined to cut down the remaining attackers before they could escape. The surviving pilots had no choice but to engage in a desperate fight for survival. A burst of gunfire tore through the wing of one American aircraft, sending it into a spiral. The pilot fought to regain control, his heart pounding as he pulled hard on the stick. His plane shuddered, barely responding, but he managed to level out just above the ocean surface. Another enemy fighter appeared on his tail, its guns blazing. He banked left, then right, trying to shake his pursuer. His radio crackled with frantic voices. Others were also locked in dogfights, each struggling to evade or outgun their opponents. Above, a pilot spotted a Zero closing in on a wounded comrade. Without hesitation, he swung around, lining up his sights. He squeezed the trigger, and bullets ripped through the enemy plane's fuselage. Smoke and flames erupted as the Zero lost control, spiraling into the sea. But there was no time to celebrate. Another enemy was already moving into position. He jerked the controls, dodging a fresh volley of gunfire. The ocean below was littered with burning wreckage, the remains of aircraft that had not been lucky enough to escape. Some American planes, too damaged to continue fighting, had no choice but to attempt crash landings. Pilots braced themselves as they skimmed the waves, hoping to survive the impact. Some managed to escape their sinking craft, clambering into rafts and signaling for rescue. Others were not so fortunate. Through the chaos, the remaining torpedo bombers struggled to escape the deadly trap. Their aircraft, built for precision strikes rather than dogfighting, were slower and more vulnerable. They relied on their escorting fighters to buy them time, but the odds were overwhelming. The Japanese had the numbers, the speed, and the advantage of defending their own fleet. Yet the Americans refused to give in. One pilot, his cockpit filled with smoke, coughed as he fought to stay airborne. His left engine was failing, his fuel gauge dangerously low, and his controls sluggish. He knew he wouldn't make it back. His only choice was to keep fighting for as long as he could, drawing enemy fire away from his retreating squadron. Gritting his teeth, he dove straight toward an approaching wave of enemy fighters, guns blazing. Explosions lit up the sky as more aircraft fell on both sides. The roar of engines, the rattle of gunfire, and the shouts over the radio blended into a deafening symphony of war. A few American planes managed to break free, pushing their engines to the limit as they made their escape. Behind them, Japanese fighters pursued relentlessly, unwilling to let any enemy leave unscathed. One by one, the American aircraft disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a battlefield of smoldering wreckage and drifting debris. The Japanese fleet had suffered damage, but it remained afloat, its defenses still strong. The Americans had struck, but at a terrible price. Many of their comrades had gone down in the fight, their fates unknown in the vast expanse of the Pacific. As the surviving pilots flew towards safety, exhaustion set in. Their hands trembled on the controls, their bodies sore from the strain of combat. The adrenaline that had kept them going began to fade, replaced by the weight of loss. They had known the mission would be dangerous, but seeing so many empty spots in their formation was a painful reminder of just how high the cost had been. Their radios remained mostly silent now, the usual chatter replaced by heavy silence. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, replaying the battle in his mind. The faces of friends who had not returned haunted them, but there was no time to dwell on grief. They still had to land, refuel, and prepare for whatever came next. The war was far from over. Ahead, the faint outline of their carrier group came into view. The sight was a relief, a reminder that they had made it back for now. One by one, they lined up for landing, their battered planes barely holding together. Deck crews rushed to assist, pulling pilots from cockpits, assessing damage, and preparing the aircraft that could still be repaired. As the last plane touched down, the realization of what had just happened sank in. The mission had not been a complete success, but it had not been a failure either. The enemy had felt their presence, had seen their determination. Though the price had been high, the fight was far from over. The pilots knew they would fly again, face danger again, and continue pushing forward until the war was won. The deck of the carrier was alive with motion as mechanics and crew members swarmed the returning planes. Smoke still curled from some of the battered aircraft, bullet-riddled fuselages telling the story of the brutal battle they had just survived. Pilots climbed out of their cockpits, some collapsing as exhaustion overtook them, others scanning the sky for comrades who would never return. The cost of the mission weighed heavily on everyone. Inside the command center, officers studied the reports coming in from the pilots. Some torpedoes had found their mark, striking enemy carriers and causing damage, but the Japanese fleet had not been crippled. The attack had slowed them, perhaps forcing a temporary retreat, but it had not been enough to deliver a decisive blow. The loss of American planes and crew was severe, and each name added to the list of the fallen deepened the grim reality of war. Among the pilots, the tension lingered. They had seen friends shot down, helpless as fire consumed aircraft or as planes plunged into the sea. Some had been forced to watch their own wingmen vanish in explosions, unable to do anything but continue flying and hope they would not be next. The quiet between them was heavy, each man dealing with his grief in his own way. One pilot sat on the edge of the deck, staring out at the ocean. His uniform was torn, his hands still shaking from the battle. He had barely made it back, his aircraft limping onto the carrier with just enough fuel to land. The image of the torpedo he had released, streaking toward the enemy ship, was burned into his mind. Had it done any real damage? Had it been enough to change the course of the fight? He had no answers, only the knowledge that they had all done what they could. Word soon spread that reconnaissance planes had been sent out to assess the situation. The results would determine their next move. The entire crew waited, knowing that if the Japanese carriers were still operational, another battle would soon follow. There was no room for complacency. Mechanics worked tirelessly to patch up damaged planes, refueling and rearming them in preparation for whatever came next. In the pilots' quarters, some men tried to sleep, but the images of the battle replayed in their minds. The sound of gunfire, the sight of planes exploding midair, the cries over the radio. It was impossible to silence. Others wrote letters home, trying to find the words to explain what they had been through, though most would never mention the full extent of the horrors they had witnessed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a briefing was called. The intelligence gathered showed that while the Japanese fleet had taken hits, they were regrouping. The damage had not been enough to sink their carriers, but it had slowed them. They would need time for repairs, and that meant a crucial window of opportunity for the Americans. The attack had not been in vain. It had bought them time. The commanding officer addressed the squadron, his expression serious but resolute. He acknowledged their losses, the bravery they had shown, and the sacrifices made. He reminded them why they fought, why every battle mattered. Though the mission had not been a complete victory, it had proven that they could strike at the heart of the enemy, that they could stand against overwhelming odds and still deliver a blow. The pilots listened, some nodding, others staring at the floor. They knew there would be more battles ahead, more missions just as dangerous, perhaps even worse. But they also knew that turning back was not an option. They had a duty, not just to themselves, but to every man who had been lost. Their fight was far from over. Later that night, the carrier moved through the dark waters, engines humming as it pressed forward. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast and unforgiving battlefield. In the distance, somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy was regrouping, preparing for their next move. For the men aboard, sleep came in uneasy fragments. Some lay awake, staring at the ceiling, their minds replaying the battle over and over. Others clutched keepsakes, reminders of home, of what they were fighting for. The war had taken so much already, and they knew it would demand even more before it was over. As dawn broke, the call to action came once again. The pilots gathered, checking their gear, preparing their aircraft. The enemy was still out there, still a threat. The battle was not over. They had survived one mission, but there would be many more. Each one was a step closer to the ultimate goal, a final victory that still seemed so far away. But until that day came, they would fly, they would fight, and they would not back down. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the ocean as the carrier continued its steady course. The sea was deceptively calm, its surface smooth and undisturbed, but the men on board knew better. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy was regrouping, their ships patching up the wounds inflicted during the last battle. There was no certainty about what lay ahead, but there was no time for hesitation. The next fight was coming, whether they were ready or not. Pilots moved across the flight deck, checking their planes, running through final inspections. The mechanics had worked through the night, patching holes, replacing damaged parts, doing everything possible to keep the aircraft battle-ready. Some planes were beyond repair, their frames too mangled from bullet impacts or crash landings. Their pilots had been reassigned to spare aircraft, if they were lucky. For others, there were no replacements, their names quietly added to the growing list of the lost. Inside the briefing room, tension filled the air. The commanding officer stood at the front, pointing at the map spread before him. The enemy fleet had taken damage, but it was still operational. Intelligence reports indicated that their carriers had not been sunk, though they had been forced to pull back for emergency repairs. It was a small victory, but one that came at a cost. The squadron had suffered heavy losses, and each man in the room knew that the next engagement could be even deadlier. The plan was straightforward. The fleet would press forward, pushing deeper into contested waters. The pilots would be called upon again, their orders the same as before: seek out and destroy the enemy carriers. They listened in silence, nodding when necessary, their faces unreadable. There was nothing left to say. They had all seen what awaited them in the skies, and no words would make it any easier. Back on deck, the signal was given. One by one, the aircraft roared to life, their engines growling as they lined up for takeoff. The pilots climbed into their cockpits, securing their harnesses, adjusting their controls. There was no time to think about anything beyond the mission. No time to dwell on the fear that sat deep in their chests. The only way forward was through. As the first planes launched into the sky, the carrier's deck crew worked in practiced efficiency, sending wave after wave of aircraft into the air. The formation tightened as they climbed higher, their course set for enemy waters. The radio remained mostly silent, the only sound the steady hum of engines as the squadron moved forward. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they neared the coordinates of the enemy fleet. The pilots scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. Then, far in the distance, dark shapes began to take form. The enemy had not retreated completely. Their carriers remained in the fight, surrounded by a protective ring of warships. The Japanese were expecting them. The silence shattered as the first anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Explosions erupted around the incoming planes, shaking the air with concussive force. The Americans pressed forward, diving low to avoid the worst of the flak. Fighter squadrons broke off, engaging in violent dogfights as the torpedo bombers made their approach. One by one, the planes lined up their attacks. Pilots clenched their jaws, focusing on their targets. At the right moment, torpedoes were released, cutting through the ocean toward the enemy ships. Some found their mark, detonating against steel hulls in powerful bursts of fire and smoke. Others were intercepted, destroyed before they could reach their targets. The Japanese defenses fought back with relentless force. Planes were hit mid-air, bursting into flames before plunging into the sea. Parachutes dotted the sky as some pilots bailed out, but many were lost in the chaos. The radio filled with frantic voices, warnings, cries for help, calls from those going down. The battle raged on, the air thick with fire and debris. More torpedoes were launched, some slipping past enemy defenses, slamming into their intended targets. One carrier, already damaged from the previous attack, began to list to one side, its crew scrambling to contain the damage. But even as the Americans inflicted losses, their own numbers dwindled. The order to retreat finally came. The surviving aircraft turned back, their fuel running low, their weapons spent. They had done what they could. Some pilots looked back, catching glimpses of burning wreckage, both enemy and ally, scattered across the ocean. There was no time to process it, no time for anything but survival. As the battered planes returned to the carrier, the deck crew rushed to receive them. Some aircraft barely made it back, landing gear failing, fuel nearly gone. Others didn't return at all. The men who had been waiting for their comrades to arrive stood in silence, counting the empty spaces, knowing exactly who had been lost. The battle had been fought, but victory was still uncertain. The enemy had taken damage, but so had they. The pilots disembarked, exhausted, their minds still in the skies even as their feet touched solid ground. There was no celebration, no relief, only the knowledge that the fight was not over. The war would continue. They would be called upon again, and they would go, because that was the job, because that was what they had sworn to do, because there was no other choice but to keep fighting until the end. The sun hung low over the Pacific as the surviving pilots stepped off their planes, their faces hollow with exhaustion. The flight deck was quieter than before, though it carried the weight of everything that had transpired. Mechanics worked on the damaged aircraft, but their movements lacked the usual urgency. Everyone knew there would be more battles ahead, but for now, there was nothing to do but count the cost. A few men lingered near the railing, staring at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, indifferent to the war waged above its waters. The waves lapped against the ship's hull, carrying the memories of fallen comrades into the unknown. No words were spoken. What could be said? The empty spaces in the formation, the missing voices over the radio, spoke louder than anything. Inside the command room, reports were finalized. The attack had inflicted more damage, but the enemy still had strength left. Their carriers had been hit, some limping, some perhaps beyond saving. Yet the fleet had not been destroyed. Victory remained distant, just beyond reach. The officers knew that soon they would have to send their men back into the fire. The pilots gathered in their quarters, peeling off their flight gear, their uniforms stained with sweat, oil, and smoke. Some sat on their bunks in silence, staring at the floor, replaying every moment. Others forced themselves to eat, their hands still trembling as they lifted spoons to their mouths. Sleep would not come easy, but their bodies ached for rest. One man pulled out a notebook, flipping to a fresh page. He hesitated, pen hovering over the paper, before finally writing a name, a friend lost in the battle. He added a few words, then another name, and another, a ritual that had become all too familiar. The list grew longer with each mission, and there was no telling how many more names would be added before it was over. Night fell over the carrier, and the ocean reflected the starlit sky. The ship pressed forward, engines humming steadily, carrying the weight of the day's battle. The world felt unchanged, though for the men aboard, nothing could ever be the same again. Some gathered on the deck, speaking in low voices. They talked about home, about the lives they had left behind. Some wondered if they would ever see it again. Others refused to think about it, knowing that hope could be dangerous. There was no room for dreams in war, only the next mission, the next flight, the next fight to survive. The chaplain held a quiet service near the bow, reading from a small, worn book. A few men listened, heads bowed, while others simply stood nearby, lost in thought. The names of the fallen were spoken, their absence felt in every pause, every breath. The ocean stretched out before them, vast and merciless, holding secrets of those it had claimed. As the night deepened, the pilots drifted to their bunks, sleep pulling them under despite the nightmares that waited. Some dreamed of fire and falling aircraft, of the ocean rushing up to meet them. Others saw home, the faces of family, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Dawn broke, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and blue. The cycle began again, engines warming up, orders being prepared, the call to action just beyond the horizon. The war was not over, and neither was their fight. They had survived another day, another mission, but there would always be another. As the first aircraft lifted into the sky, the men below watched them go, knowing that some would not return. But they did not hesitate. This was their duty, their purpose, the path they had chosen. No matter how much it took from them, no matter how many they lost, they would keep going. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, the sky waiting to be filled with fire once more. The war would not wait. And so, with hearts heavy but resolve unshaken, they took to the skies again, disappearing into the horizon, ready to face whatever came next.